Good evening. It is good to see you all this evening. We are continuing, of course, our study we've been going through on tactics, going through some of the basic principles from the book, but also just trying to kind of put them in very practical kind of presentation for us to try and use this as a, I guess maybe a template or a cheat sheet, even if you will, to being effective in our conversations with other people. So, I know it's been a couple weeks, but we talked about the first question of what we what we call in the book the Columbo tactics. We talked about the first question last time, which was 2 weeks ago. I know it's been 2 weeks, but I was hoping that we would practice a little bit. Either way, what's the question? What do you mean by that? Very good, very good. We don't have to do lesson all over again. Okay, so what do you mean by that? That is the question that we looked at for the first thing. The idea of that question is I'm trying to gather information. I'm trying to make sure I don't misunderstand the other person or I don't misinterpret what they've said. I'm trying to give them a chance to revise their statement if they've said something they didn't mean to say. All of that is going to help me know what I'm dealing with to help figure out how to get from point A to point B. We talked about if you're going to take something from point A to point B, well, you got to know where point A is first, right? So we've got to know where we're at, or more specifically where the person's at, in terms of what they know, what they understand, what their thinking is, before we can move forward. That's the first question. I hope that that will be something that we will just keep in the back of our minds always when we get into these conversations, because a lot of times that's the question or some form of it that we need to be asking to try and start off the conversation and begin to go in a direction that will be useful and productive. But we're going to start looking at the second question now as we move into tonight. Now, instead of gathering information, the purpose of the question we're going to look at tonight is the idea of reversing the burden of proof. Now, we're not going to get to the question just yet, but let's go and talk about that phrase, burden of proof. Anybody know what burden of proof means? Comes from courtroom type terminology. Okay, you have to prove your accusations. Specifically, who has the burden of proof in a courtroom case? Okay, the prosecution. The prosecution is saying this happened. The defense, they're saying they're opposing, right? They're saying this didn't happen, but they are taking not the positive, if you will, or the affirmative, they're taking the negative. So let's just consider this. In a courtroom scene, one of several examples for the evening, but for the burden of proof specifically, in a courtroom, if you have someone who is the prosecution, they're making an accusation, the defense never says anything to defend themselves, never says anything, this is, why I didn't do it or anything like that, never puts a shred of evidence forward, but neither does the prosecution. Who wins? Neither side puts forth any evidence. Who wins? The defense. Because whether or not the defense can prove they didn't do it, doesn't matter. It's the prosecution's job. It's the one making the statement, this happened. It's their job to prove it. As we think about this concept, I want us to think about another situation. Let's say you are a police detective, not a private detective, but an actual law enforcement officer, and you are going to the scene of a crime. You show up to this crime, and you see several things. You see, I don't want to get too graphic. Liz is influencing me with all of her murder stories that she listens to. You see a body, let's just leave it at that, right? You see a body, I'm about to get really creative. You see a body, you see, let's say, a gun, you see a knife, you see, a balloon, and you see a wrecked car, okay? You see this all kind of in the parking lot or something, right? Okay, so you see all this. You look at all this evidence, and you say, well, I think that someone was trying to blow up a balloon while they were driving, and as they were driving, someone had left a knife in the road. They drove over the knife, which caused them to wreck the car, and then when they got out, they dropped their gun because they have a concealed carry permit, and it went off and shot them in the face. Okay. Danny's shaking his head. He's like, oh, yeah. What's the problem with that? It's a fun story, right? What's the problem? Do what?
No proof.
No proof. It's an assumption. You can't prove it. What is it? What would we call that? what we just did. We took evidence, right? He saw evidence, but what did he do with the evidence? He created a story, or what we sometimes call a narrative. Now, is that narrative possible? Is it possible someone was blowing up a little balloon while they were driving, drove over a knife, which caused them to wreck a car, they step out of the vehicle, they drop a gun, and it accidentally goes off? Honestly, that last part is probably the least likely, because it's awfully hard to get a gun to go off and just drop it. Almost impossible. But, yeah, you got to be really stupid. But everything else, right, technically is possible. But just because you come up with that story, is that evidence? No. I could just as easily say a guy was driving, he wrecked his car and rammed into another person's car who got mad at him, but that car was able to drive away, and there were some kids in the wrecked car, and one of them had a balloon, and they popped in the middle of all this, and the other guy was mad that he hit him, and so he shot him, and then drove off, or whatever. That's another story, right? That's just as plausible. Yes, Andy.
You want to be careful calling people stupid, because I dropped the gun and it went off and hit me.
Fair enough. Hey, Ann said it, not me. I wasn't saying it. Very point. Very fair point. Nonetheless, the idea that we're talking about here, if you have things in front of you, evidence even, we would call it, right? That's what we would call it in a police situation. This is evidence, the knife and the gun and all that kind of stuff. You can't just make a story that includes all the evidence. You actually have to have that evidence line up with more evidence. You have to actually do some research. Okay, was the gun fired? Is there blood on the knife? How long has the car been here? All these kind of things. You can't just make up a narrative. What I'm trying to get at, as we're starting in tonight, narratives can be great, but they're not evidence for anything. I can come up with a story that incorporates whatever elements I want it to. I can have a story that includes people. I can have a story that includes situations and events and places and all that kind of stuff. I can come up with whatever stories I want to. But a story, a narrative, is not evidence. Now, why do we need to say that? Because in our world, especially in the 21st century America, narratives are just about the only thing people know. If you ask someone why they believe something, 9 times out of 10, you know what they're going to do? They're not going to give you evidence. They're going to tell you the story that leads them to the assumption. But the story may or may not be true. They just think it sounds good. That's the world we live in right now. That goes along with postmodernism and relativism and all those kind of things. If the narrative works, well then, it's appealing to people. People will latch onto it. But narratives aren't evidence. And as Christians, we need to recognize when we're being fed a narrative or given a narrative in a conversation and when we're actually being given evidence. Think about what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Test everything, he says. Hold fast what is good. Now, he uses in the book a very good illustration. People in, again, 21st century Western culture, do they expect Christians to prove what they believe to a degree? There are some who will say, oh, well, faith is just a blind leap. But in terms of, if a Christian says God exists, does the world expect us to provide proof for that? Yeah. And well, they should, right? That's a pretty incredible supernatural claim that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead. We need to provide proof for that if we're going to make that claim. But you see, it doesn't work the other way around in people's minds anyway. It should, but it doesn't. If I say, well, you believe that the world started through, naturalistic evolution, could you provide some evidence for that? Again, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get the story of evolution, but you're not going to get any evidence. You're not going to get, here is why we can conclude this, most likely. Most people are just going to give you the story. Well, there was this point in space, and it exploded, and then you have all these kind of things like congealing of the stars, and eventually the minerals in the stars kind of coalesce, and then you have the ultimate development of a single-cell organism, which develops into, they'll give you the narrative. That's not evidence. We should be providing evidence, but we should also be asking for evidence in these conversations that we're having with people. We don't need to accept that we always have the burden of proof and everyone else doesn't. Yes, if I make a statement, God is real, Jesus rose from the dead, the Bible is inspired. If I make the statement, yes, I need to be able to back it up with evidence. But usually, in these kind of conversations that we're talking about, the other person is the one who makes the statement. And then they expect me to have the burden of proof. They expect me to prove my beliefs after they've made the statement. A lot of times before I've even told them what I believe. That's not how this works. Now, it's how they want it to work. But we don't have to settle for that. Now, does that mean we're trying to avoid giving evidence for what we believe? Not at all. But if someone says, I don't believe in God, it's irrational to believe in God. And then I say, well, I believe in God. And they say, well, prove to me that God exists. Our instinct, right, because this is honestly, at least to some extent, how we've been trained by our culture, our instinct is to launch into, well, I believe in God because this, I believe in God because that, I believe God. Hold on a second. They've made a statement. I can call them out and say, well, wait a minute. Why do you believe? What evidence do you have? I can hold them to account because they've made a statement. You ever seen someone building a roof? I saw one just a couple weeks ago. It's here in town, actually. Someone was up on the roof. I don't think they were building it from scratch, but they were repairing it or something like that. Building a roof, right? Roof really nice, air or watertight rather. It keeps it out the rain. It keeps the elements out. Looks nice. All those kind of things. What happens if the roof is on the ground? Like you just let's move out these piers on this side. We're going to build a roof right here, just on the ground. Doesn't do anybody any good. We need to start thinking about argument, conversation, evidence in that way. An argument without evidence is like a roof without walls. Oh yeah, it looks nice. I'm sure it would do great if it was on something, but without walls it's nothing. It's just a roof on the ground. For an argument, a statement, an assertion to have any weight, to be respected at all, it's got to have some proof to it. There's got to be walls to support the roof. Otherwise, this whole thing just doesn't work. So our first question is about gathering information. I want to make sure I understand what their roof looks like. I want to make sure I understand what they're proposing, what they're saying. This is true. Once I understand that, then I've got to force them to have walls. Because most people, when you get into especially religious conversations like the kinds we're talking about, most people, they just expect to be able to lay the roof out and then you have to deal with it. No, I'm not going to deal with that. Now, that doesn't mean I can't. I have the evidence on my side, but that's not going to be the most effective way to conduct this conversation. I need to force them to actually build the whole house, and then I can show them why the walls don't stand up. So, here's our next question. Columbo 2. How did you come to that conclusion? How did you come to that conclusion? They've made a statement. We've gathered enough information. What do you mean by that? To make sure we understand their statement. But now, we need to make sure they are defending their statement. They've made a statement, so they have the burden of proof. So I just want to know how they came to the conclusion. How did you reach that conclusion? How did you, what convinced you of that? There's all different ways we can phrase this, but the point is the same. I want not just the narrative, not just the idea. I want to know what convinced you that that was true. Now, in a day and age where people mostly work with narratives and nothing else, you know how many times this question will get you a blank look? Why? Because, quite frankly, people aren't taught to have evidence for what they believe anymore. People are just taught to, oh, that sounds good and fits with what I already think. So there we go. It all works together. The story works nicely. Oh, I can create a ton of stories. But story is not evidence. How did you come to that conclusion? Now, we need to think about three things as we're talking about this idea of evidence and coming to conclusions. We alluded to a couple of them earlier, but I want to kind of go through this process. Someone makes a statement. I don't know. What do we want to say here? The sky is blue. Let's just take a real simple one, all right? Sky is blue. First of all, let's ask the question. Is it possible for the sky to be blue? Well, yeah. I mean, things can be colors, right? Okay. Is it plausible? Well, I can see it with my own eyes, so it's pretty plausible. Is it probable? Yes, again, all the evidence points to the sky being blue. Therefore, the sky is blue. Okay? Super easy if we do it that way. Let's think about something that's more difficult. Let's go with, all right, I'm going to step on some conspiracy theorist toes here. The moon landing fake. The moon landing was fake. That's the argument. Now, there are people who believe that. I'm not trying to get on their case. Maybe some people in this room believe that. If so, I would love to have a talk later. But many people think the moon landing was fake. I'm not going to send you to hell if you believe that. But let's think about it for a second. Trying to use our process. Is it possible that the moon landing was fake? If it's not possible, then we can eliminate it right there. But let's think about it. Is it possible the moon landing was fake? It would be possible during that day and time to set up a camera, to set up a stage, to have somebody on wires and stuff like that, kind of bouncing around along the thing. It's possible, sure. Is it plausible that the moon landing was faked? Well, let's start thinking about the numbers involved. Let's start thinking about all the people who worked on that project, about the fact that there was a live stream that you have from the moon to people's TVs at that point in time, that ultimately you have a ton of people back, at the scene of NASA who are all involved in this. Is it plausible that not just that you could shoot the footage, that part's not hard at all, that's the easy part. Is it plausible that once it is faked, you can broadcast it to everyone and ultimately keep the fact that it's fake a secret for that long? Not only that you can keep it a secret for that long just in a confined space in a place like America, but that you can keep it secret that long when you're in a space race with the Soviet Union, who would love nothing better than to be able to expose you. And by the way, the Soviets had a whole lot of intelligence officers in America operating at that time. They would love nothing better than to find evidence that the moon landing was faked and expose it so that America doesn't beat them in the space race at that point. Is it plausible? Is it possible? Maybe. It's awfully big pill to swallow, right? But we still have another question to ask after that. Is it probable? Even if it's possible, even if it's plausible, right? There are ways to make this happen. Is it the most likely explanation of all the evidence? Now again, I'm not trying to step on people's toes. No, it's not. Again, people might disagree, that's fine. I'm not trying to make a big deal of this. I'm just trying to use something to help us practice our discernment. We talked about that in Hebrews 5. It's not probable. The most probable fact, or the most probable, what am I trying to say, conclusion, that's where I'm going. The most probable conclusion from all the evidence is that it happens, like it doesn't happen. Because the odds that it will be exposed on so many different levels is just so high, because there's so many people involved and all of the motivation for different groups of people to expose it. I mean, can you imagine how much the Soviets would have paid for a NASA employee to defect and reveal that the moon landing was fake? So this is the kind of process we're talking about. If someone wants to present something, they have to present evidence for it. And if they try and present evidence for it, well, then we start calling them. Wait, is what you're saying actually possible? Is the idea actually even possible that you're talking about? For example, let's use the life evolving from goop. Okay? Is that possible? Quite frankly, no. Scientifically, on every possible level, it defies the laws of biogenesis, it defies the laws of thermodynamics and entropy, it defies so many laws of science, it defies all human experience, it defies everything we know about life, that life could come from non-life. Every single experiment they've tried to do to even get, say, basic amino acids or proteins or something like that to come out of non-life have just been utter failures. Now, I tried to build them up and say, oh, look what we did. You really didn't do anything when it comes right down to it. Not to mention, you tried to create the perfect conditions and you still didn't actually make it work. It's frankly not possible. Even if on the level of 1 in a trillion chances, which is mathematically impossible. 1 in a trillion is mathematically impossible. But even if you have 1 in a trillion chances, which is much higher than that, by the way, well, now we go to, is it plausible? Well, certainly, if it's a 1 in a trillion, no, it's not plausible. And then, is it not probable? Well, by definition, it's improbable, right? Doesn't work. No matter how many narratives you want to spin, the fact is, it doesn't meet the evidence. It doesn't answer these questions accurately. This is why we ask for evidence. Now, people aren't expecting for Christians to ask for evidence. Because, as we've already said, they've been told, and I'm saying the broad population, right? They've been told we operate solely on blind leaps of faith. That's what Christianity is in the mind of many people. It's believing in cosmic Santa Claus. It's believing in something I want to believe just because I want to believe it, and that's it. That's what most people believe Christianity is at this point. So they're not expecting us to ask for evidence. They don't believe we care about evidence. So when we not only are interested in evidence, but are interested in their evidence, people are getting caught off guard. And they're going to try and give us a narrative. And we're not going to accept that. We want why you came to the conclusion based on evidence, not just based on that sounds nice, why you came to a conclusion like you have. Let's consider some of the questions we looked at last time, but applied to this question instead of what do you mean by that? We already talked somewhat about this one. It's irrational to believe in God. We could ask questions like, what do you mean by irrational? What do you mean by God? But how could we ask our question that we're talking about tonight related to this statement? How about the word?
What conclusion led you to believe there was no God?
Okay? What led you to believe there is no God? What evidence have you considered that led you to that conclusion? Why do you think that, even? What do you mean by that? Why do you think that? There's all sorts of different ways we could do it. What about all religions are basically the same? How might we begin to dig for evidence? How might we word that question? How did you come to that conclusion? How else might we word that?
What do you mean about that? What do you mean that all religions are basically the same?
Okay, that's our first question, but yes, we could word it that way. What else?
What evidence do you have?
Okay, what evidence do you have? Maybe something like, what religions have you studied? You must have studied a lot of religions to come to that conclusion. Or maybe something like, oh, I would love to hear more about your findings on your research. Things like that. Anything to get them thinking in terms of, oh, I actually have to prove this. What about, Bible was only written by men? How did you come to that conclusion? How else might we kind of address that? What makes you think that? What can make brought you that conclusion? What kind of evidence would someone most likely, or maybe I should say, what lack of evidence would someone most likely be operating on to say that? Didn't word that question very well. I'm trying to. If the Bible was only written by men, well, they have to have something that brought them to that conclusion. Most likely something along the lines of, well, everything that's written is written by men, right? Something along those lines. So maybe something along the lines of, so what evidence could convince you that a person could write outside of his own ability? Or something like that. Would there be any evidence that could convince you that a person could write something with a message that was beyond their own understanding?
Who was the inspiration for the man to write the Bible?
Okay, you could do, who is the inspiration, or even you could go with the idea of, I want to understand why he came to this conclusion. Maybe, where did you read that? That's another one that we could put. Or who have you talked to about that? Who have you interviewed? How have you researched this? Are there scholarly things that you've been looking at? Are there people online that you've been looking at? That could be, again, for all of these. Let's get another one here. You shouldn't force your morals on others. How might we use our question there? Again, remember, we can use just the straight, how did you come to that conclusion in all of these. I'm just trying to get us to think. There's ways of kind of modifying it, tweaking it just slightly to specific statements and situations, topics. Shouldn't force your morals on others. Okay. I didn't realize people were forcing their morals. Tell me more about that. I didn't know of this phenomenon, right? Well, we already actually looked at this quite a bit. Evolution is a proven fact of science. Really? I was not aware of that. I genuinely am not aware of that because I don't believe it is, right? I was not aware that that's the case. I've heard a lot of people say that, but I've never actually seen the proof. What could you share with me what the proof is for that? What is the proof? That's an easy one, right? Because they mentioned proof, so all I have to do is, show me the proof, right? I'll probably word it a little bit nicer than that. If God were loving and just, evil couldn't exist. Now, most people will say that as if it is just an airtight statement, right? If they say that, they believe this is just an inherent truism. So what might we do with this? So how did you conclude that love and justice are opposites or are mutually exclusive? Have you looked into the concept of mutual exclusivity? Now again, depending on who you're talking to, that might not be the word you want to use, but we're trying to get them in any way possible to start talking about evidence. And let's just kind of try and track this for a second. So we say some version of how have you come to that conclusion? And they say, well, it's evident, right? If God's loving, then he wouldn't punish people. If he punishes people, he can't be loving. Evil wouldn't exist if he's both, right? So what do we do then? I'm sorry, but I didn't ask you to repeat yourself. Again, maybe we got worded like that, but we see what they're doing, right? They're not giving evidence. They're simply rephrasing the narrative. No, I understand that. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it. I understand what you said. That's essentially what it already says, or what you already said. I'm saying, how did you come to the conclusion that those two can't be in the same being? How do you come to the conclusion that God can't be both loving and just and evil still exists? You're going, and this is why it's called Columbo, you're going to sound either dumb or annoying or both when you start really hammering a point, as in keeping on asking questions. You're going to start being like, well, I just told you. Always be kind, always be considerate, always be respectful, but they didn't just tell you anything, except for a narrative. You keep on asking for proof until eventually they either have to reconcile with the fact that they don't have proof, or they start beginning to ask questions themselves. They're starting to put that rock in their shoes that they keep on feeling every time they take a step. It's ignorant to take the Bible literally. We've already talked about, what do you mean by taking it literally, all those kind of things. Well, how did you conclude it's ignorant? Have you seen people do this? Maybe here's one. They might use proof if you ask them and lead them this way. Have you seen people taking the Bible literally that you felt like was ignorant? Could you tell me about some of those times where you've seen that? Right? Then they tell you. And a lot of times, what will happen when they tell you something like that? If they've seen someone taking the Bible literally and doing it in a poor way, a lot of times, what you're going to see? Oh yeah, I completely agree. But they weren't actually taking the Bible literally. They were misinterpreting the Bible. That's why what they were doing was ignorance. They weren't actually following the Bible. Abortion issue. A fetus is human, but it's not a person. Oh, I was unaware of that scientific breakthrough in biological research. Could you show me the article where that was discovered by a scientist? Again, that sounds snarky. I don't want to word it just like that, but I'm trying to give you the intent of where we're going with this. If they are saying that this is true, a fetus is human, but it's not a person, that's a nice sentiment. That fits well with the narrative. But that's a biological, scientific statement that they're just making. I've just decided that this is scientific fact. Well, we don't get to decide scientific facts. We have to prove scientific facts, or at least we used to, right? What scientists have you been reading that have come to that conclusion? What evidence did they use to base their conclusion on? All these things, again, I'm trying to get us thinking in terms of keep on digging for proof. The more you dig, the more you're going to find either they're not prepared for it, they don't have it, they don't think it's important, or just maybe you might stick something in there and they're like, oh, I haven't thought about that before. That doesn't make sense, does it? I'll have to think about it and get back to you. Right? Which, by the way, is a very appropriate thing for us to say, too, if we're asked a question that we don't know how to answer. But all these things, hopefully, as examples, and we'll go ahead and wrap up. Once again, once we've gathered some evidence to make sure we understand where they're coming from, now it's time to zero in on, all right, you've made a statement. Now, you can't just make it and expect everybody to believe it. You got to back it up with something. No one should accept something. No one should believe something without evidence. And you're the one who's made the statement, this should be believed. So help me out. What evidence brought you to the conclusion? What evidence convinced you that this is true? And when you get honest people, not everyone's honest, but some are. When you get honest people, and you can be honest, by the way, and not have thought this through until someone questions you, which is what we're going for. Our hope is that in these conversations, we're talking to people who will be honest with themselves. They just haven't thought it through. It's not that they're insincere. They generally have never been challenged to actually prove this to themselves. If they're honest, they'll start thinking, well, wait a minute, why do I believe this? And we shouldn't be afraid of that. You know why? Because if they are actually start looking for evidence, they're going to find evidence. And it's not going to back up something that's against God. Because what God says is true. Which means it's going to be backed up by the evidence. Columbo 2. It lets us take the next step. We're moving on from just understanding the lay of the land, right? Understanding the playing field, understanding the positions. We're moving on. Now we're trying to get people to back up their position. This is really, yes, what do you mean by that? That can start getting people thinking. This is really where you start getting people asking questions of themselves, of you, of the world. This is really where you can get people, I'm saying this in a positive sense, doubting. If you believe something is false, what has to happen for you to believe something is true? You have to doubt what you already believe first. We talk about doubt a lot of times in Christianity as if it's a bad thing. And if we're talking about doubting what God says, yes, in a sense that is a bad thing, although sometimes that's the process of growth. But doubting is the best thing in the world if someone believes something's wrong. And that's what we're trying to do ultimately. Any thoughts or comments before we wrap up? Alright. As always, if there is anything that we can do to encourage, to help you tonight, we always want to make that opportunity available. So if there is something, please listen as we stand and sing.
Just a few more days to be filled with praise and to tell the